The autumn wind whipped across the Virginia City Station platform as Matthew Harris pulled his worn leather coat tighter, watching the approaching train with weary eyes. 20 years of ranching in Nevada territory had etched deep lines around those eyes, though at 42 he still stood straight-backed and strong. The railroad had changed everything about this mining town nestled in the shadow of Mount Davidson, bringing both prosperity and problems to their quiet corner of the frontier. Clouds of steam billowed across the wooden platform as the locomotive ground to a halt, its iron wheels screaming against the rails. Matthew checked his pocket watch, 3:15 p.m., right on schedule for the weekly supply train from Santa Fe. He was expecting a shipment of mining equipment for the Silver Queen mine, where he served as both rancher and unofficial security for the operation. What emerged from the passenger car, however, made him question whether he was seeing things clearly in the fading autumn light. 5 women stepped down onto the platform, each shrouded in dark traveling cloaks despite the mild weather. They moved with an eerie synchronization, like a flock of ravens settling on a fence post. The tallest among them, her face obscured by a deep hood, carried what appeared to be a leather document case clutched tightly to her chest. Matthew's hand instinctively moved closer to the revolver at his hip. In his experience, unexpected arrivals rarely brought good news. The station master, John Wright, hurried over with his ledger, clearly as surprised as Matthew by these unusual passengers. "Ladies, welcome to Virginia City. I don't seem to have any record of expected arrivals today. Might I ask your business?" The women remained silent, but the one with the document case stepped forward, lowering her hood to reveal striking features and eyes that held both intelligence and barely concealed fear. "I am Victoria King. My companions and I are here on behalf of the Western Mining Corporation." Matthew felt his jaw tighten at the mention of Western Mining. The corporation had been buying up claims across the territory, using methods that often strayed into questionable territory. He'd heard whispers of forged documents, threatened claim holders, and mysterious accidents befalling those who refused to sell. Yet here stood 5 well-dressed women claiming to represent them. Something wasn't adding up. Victoria King's voice carried across the platform with surprising authority. "Mr. Harris, we were told you would meet us." Matthew's surprise must have shown on his face because she added, "Yes, we know who you are. We've come a long way to speak with you about matters that concern both our interests." The other women remained motionless, their faces hidden, like sentinels guarding a secret too dangerous to share in the open air. The wind picked up again, carrying with it the distant sound of dynamite from the mines, a daily reminder of how the mountains themselves were being torn apart in the endless hunt for silver. Matthew studied Victoria's face, noting the slight tremor in her hands despite her confident tone. "My ranch is no place for ladies such as yourselves," he said carefully. "Perhaps the hotel would be more suitable." "No hotels!" Victoria cut him off sharply. "No public establishments. What we have to discuss must remain private. Your ranch is exactly where we need to be." The other women shifted slightly, drawing closer together. One of them, shorter than the rest, seemed to be fighting back tears beneath her hood. Matthew had seen enough fear in his life to recognize it, even when carefully hidden. The station master cleared his throat nervously, clearly uncertain about this unusual situation. "Mr. Harris, shall I send word to Andrew Lewis about these visitors?" Andrew Lewis was the mine superintendent and Matthew's direct superior. But something in Victoria's eyes made him shake his head. "No need, John. I'll handle this myself." He couldn't explain why, but he knew this moment would change everything. He could feel it in his bones like the pressure drop before a storm. As Matthew led the women to his waiting wagon, he noticed how they moved. Not like proper society ladies, but like people accustomed to watching their backs. The youngest among them stumbled slightly, and her cloak parted to reveal what looked like bandages wrapped around her wrist. Victoria quickly steadied her, shooting Matthew a challenging look, daring him to ask questions. He simply nodded and helped them into the wagon, knowing the true story would come soon enough. The wagon wheels groaned against the rocky mountain path as Matthew guided the horses higher into the foothills. Behind him, the women sat in tense silence, their cloaks drawn tight despite the afternoon heat. The mining camp's wooden structures grew smaller below them, while ahead, the jagged peaks of the Rockies pierced the clouds like nature's warning signs. He'd chosen the longer route to his outpost, avoiding the main road where the railroad crews were laying new track. Something told him these women didn't want to be seen. Victoria leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're taking us away from Virginia City." It wasn't a question. Matthew nodded without turning around, keeping his eyes on the treacherous path. "My station's about 3 miles up, more private there." He felt her studying him, weighing whether to trust this stranger who hadn't asked the obvious questions. The youngest girl, he guessed she couldn't be more than 16, whimpered softly as the wagon hit a particularly rough patch. The late summer air carried the sharp scent of pine and dynamite, the latter from the railroad crews blasting their way through the mountain. Matthew had watched them for months, cutting their iron path through the wilderness, bringing so-called progress at the expense of everything else. He'd seen what that progress had done to the local tribes, to the land itself. Now, looking at these women's haunted expressions, he wondered what other prices were being paid for civilization's march westward. As they crested the ridge, his outpost came into view, a sturdy log cabin with a covered porch and separate stable, backed against a sheer cliff face. Smoke curled from the chimney where his ranch hand, David, would be preparing the evening meal. Matthew noticed how the women tensed at the sight of another person. "David's reliable," he assured them. "Known him since the war. Whatever brought you here, you're safe now." Rebecca, the oldest after Victoria, spoke for the first time. "Safety is a relative term, Mr. Harris, especially when the law itself is corrupted." Her words carried the weight of bitter experience, and Matthew felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. He'd suspected the railroad company's influence ran deep in Virginia City, had seen how Andrew Lewis and his ilk operated above the law. But the fear in these women's eyes suggested something far darker than mere corporate greed. David emerged from the cabin as they approached, his weathered face showing surprise at their unexpected guests. Matthew gave him a subtle shake of the head, their usual signal for discretion needed. The ranch hand merely nodded and began unhitching the horses, acting as if 5 mysterious women arriving unannounced was an everyday occurrence. The youngest girl finally looked up, revealing a face marked by both youth and hardship. "I'm Grace," she said softly, accepting Matthew's help down from the wagon. Inside the cabin, the women slowly began to shed their cloaks, revealing clothes that told different stories. Victoria and Rebecca wore what had once been fine dresses, now travel-stained and torn. The others wore simpler garments, but all showed signs of a hasty departure and hard journey. Matthew busied himself stoking the fire, giving them space to settle while David quietly prepared coffee and basic provisions. The atmosphere remained charged with unspoken tensions and secrets. Victoria finally broke the silence, her voice stronger now that they were away from prying eyes. "We came from Santa Fe, Mr. Harris, though some of us started our journey much further east." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "We've seen things, documented things, about the railroad's expansion that certain powerful men would prefer stayed hidden. Things that make simple corporate greed look almost innocent by comparison." The other women exchanged knowing glances, and Matthew realized he was now entangled in something far larger and more dangerous than he'd imagined. The wind howled outside, rattling the cabin's windows as if nature itself was responding to the weight of Victoria's words. Matthew thought about the sealed documents he'd been asked to deliver, the strange shipments that arrived at odd hours, the workers who disappeared without explanation. He'd kept his head down, told himself it wasn't his business. But looking at these women, especially young Grace with her bandaged wrists, he knew that time was over. Whatever storm was coming, he was now part of it. Matthew pulled his worn leather chair closer to the fire, gesturing for Victoria and the other women to gather round. Through the window, he could see dark clouds building over the jagged peaks, promising the kind of storm that could trap them all here for days. Part of him welcomed it. These women clearly needed a safe haven, and his remote cabin, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the mining territory, might be the closest thing they'd find. "The railroad's been buying up land all through these mountains," he said, his voice low and measured. "But it ain't just for laying track. I've seen survey teams marking spots that make no sense for a rail line, deep in the hollows, far from any possible route." He reached for a map spread across his desk, its corners weighted down with brass shells. "They're looking for something else, something worth more than silver or gold." Victoria nodded grimly, pulling a leather-bound journal from beneath her cloak. "We found documentation in Santa Fe, geological surveys that were never meant to be seen. They've discovered deposits of a rare mineral essential for making steel stronger than anyone's ever seen before. Matthew Harris wiped the sweat from his brow as he studied the strange procession of women making their way down from the cargo wagon. Their dark cloaks seemed oddly formal for the dusty mountain setting of Virginia City, where even the wealthiest mine owners dressed practically. As ranch foreman of the Double Crown, he'd expected another shipment of mining equipment, not this mysterious group that moved with such deliberate grace through the early morning haze. The tallest woman, who introduced herself as Victoria Wright, carried herself with an unmistakable air of authority. Her steel-gray eyes held Matthew's gaze as she explained they were investors from back east, here to examine the proposed railroad route through Harris Valley. But something in her careful choice of words and the way the other women hung back, particularly the youngest one called Grace Lewis, set Matthew's instincts on edge. "The railroad's bringing nothing but trouble," grumbled John Young, the aging stablemaster, as he helped unload the women's trunks. "First they send their fancy surveyors, now these city ladies thinking they can tell us where to lay tracks." Matthew noticed how Victoria's shoulders stiffened at the comment, though she kept her face carefully neutral. The other women exchanged quick glances that spoke volumes. That evening, as Matthew showed them to their quarters in the ranch's guest house, he overheard a heated whispered argument between Victoria and Rebecca King, the copper-haired woman who seemed to be her second-in-command. "We can't wait any longer," Rebecca insisted. "They're already moving the Chinese workers into position. If we don't act now..." Victoria silenced her with a sharp gesture as Matthew approached. Over the next few days, Matthew observed the women making detailed sketches of the surrounding terrain and taking measurements with sophisticated surveying equipment. They paid particular attention to the narrow gorge where the railroad company planned to blast through the mountain. Hannah Young, John's wife who helped in the kitchen, reported they asked endless questions about the mining operations and property boundaries. The truth began unraveling when Michael Wright, Victoria's brother and a railroad executive, arrived unannounced from Santa Fe. His face darkened with rage upon seeing the women. "So this is where you've hidden them," he snarled at Matthew, though they'd never met. "These women are industrial saboteurs. They've already disrupted 3 major railway projects back east." Victoria stepped forward, her composure unshaken. "We're engineers and geologists," Victoria declared, her voice ringing with conviction. "Women barred from working in our fields because of nothing but prejudice. The railways you're building cut through sacred lands, destroy watersheds, and kill the very communities you claim to serve. We've seen it happen too many times." The other women moved to stand beside her, forming a unified front. Matthew's world shifted as Victoria revealed the maps and documents they'd smuggled out of railroad offices, evidence of bribes, unsafe construction practices, and deliberately misrouted tracks designed to bankrupt certain landowners while enriching others. Among the targeted properties was the Double Crown itself, which sat on a massive silver deposit the railroad aimed to claim through eminent domain. David King, the mining camp's doctor, arrived in a cloud of dust, bringing news that changed everything. The Chinese workers had been secretly organizing a strike, and the railroad's hired guns were moving in to break it violently. Rebecca's eyes flashed with a fierce light. "This is exactly what happened in Laredo," she said. "We won't let them repeat those massacres here." The women's true mission became clear. They weren't just fighting against the railroad's expansion, but for a complete reformation of how such projects were undertaken. Their technical expertise, combined with their moral conviction, had already helped multiple communities negotiate fairer terms. But in Virginia City, with millions in silver at stake, the railroad wasn't interested in compromise. As tensions mounted, Andrew Lewis, the local marshal, found himself torn between his duty to maintain order and the growing evidence of the railroad's corruption. The women's presence had catalyzed something that had been brewing for months, a resistance that united miners, ranchers, and merchants against the railway's ruthless tactics. Matthew realized he stood at a crossroads that would define not just his future, but the soul of the frontier itself. The railroad's response came swift and brutal. Armed men began appearing in town, harassing anyone associated with the women. Matthew discovered his cattle blocked from water sources by mysteriously erected fences. Supply wagons to the Double Crown were turned back, but Victoria and her companions seemed to have anticipated this, revealing elaborate contingency plans that spoke of long experience in such battles. In the shadows of dusk, Matthew watched from his vantage point as railroad crews worked late into the evening, their lanterns dotting the mountainside like fireflies. Victoria had shown him detailed maps revealing how the railroad's supposed necessary route through Double Crown land was actually a costly detour, one designed solely to pressure holdout ranchers into selling at ruinous prices. The truth of their corruption was becoming clearer with each passing day, but so too was the danger. Rebecca, who had once worked as a telegraph operator back east, intercepted a coded message that confirmed their worst fears. The railroad was bringing in more than just survey crews and laborers. They were assembling a private army of hired guns, many with notorious reputations from Kansas to the Dakotas. These weren't men who asked questions or showed mercy. They were being paid to solve problems permanently. At the Double Crown, Victoria and her companions had transformed the ranch into a fortress of resistance. Hannah's medical knowledge proved invaluable as she tended to injured miners and ranchers who'd faced railroad intimidation. Grace, with her background in law, drafted detailed documentation of every violation and act of aggression. They were building a case that could shake the very foundations of the railroad's power in the territory. Marshal Andrew Lewis made his way up to the ranch one evening, his expression grave. He'd received orders from the territorial governor to begin eviction proceedings against several smaller ranches that had allied themselves with Matthew's cause. The pressure was mounting from all sides, and Andrew's sympathies were increasingly at odds with his badge. "They're trying to make this about law and order," he said quietly. "But we both know it's about power and greed." The women's network extended far beyond Virginia City. Through carefully coded letters and trusted messengers, they maintained contact with similar groups fighting the railroads from Santa Fe to Amarillo. Victoria revealed that they had been tracking the railroad's pattern of corruption and violence for years, gathering evidence and building alliances. Each woman carried scars from previous battles, some visible, others buried deep beneath carefully maintained composure. Matthew found himself increasingly drawn to Victoria's quiet strength and tactical brilliance. During late-night strategy sessions, she spoke of similar conflicts she'd witnessed in other territories, where entire communities had been destroyed by corporate greed masked as progress. Her eyes held both steel and sorrow when she described the families who'd lost everything. This wasn't just about land anymore. It was about the very soul of the frontier. The situation reached a breaking point when railroad crews began dynamiting in the hills above Double Crown's water source, claiming they were merely clearing the way for tracks. But Grace's research into geological surveys proved they were deliberately destabilizing the watershed. If successful, they would destroy not only Matthew's ranch, but the water supply for dozens of smaller farms downstream. Working through the night, Matthew and Victoria organized an emergency gathering of ranchers, miners, and merchants whose livelihoods depended on that water. The meeting was held in an abandoned silver mine, away from prying eyes. As Victoria laid out their evidence of the railroad's true intentions, the atmosphere grew thick with anger and determination. These were people who had carved their lives out of unforgiving land. They wouldn't surrender it without a fight. Deep in the mine's shadows, Abigail, the youngest of Victoria's group, shared intelligence she'd gathered while posing as a serving girl in Virginia City's saloons. The railroad's chief engineer was expected to arrive within the week, bringing with him signed orders from back east. Orders that would give their operations a veneer of legal authority while concealing their true purpose. If they could intercept those documents, they might finally have the proof needed to expose the entire scheme. As dawn approached, Matthew stood with Victoria at the mine's entrance, watching the first hints of light touch the mountain peaks. The coming days would determine not just their fate, but the future of the entire region. The railroad had money, political influence, and hired guns on their side. But Matthew and his allies had something more powerful: the truth and people willing to die defending it. The real war for the soul of the frontier was about to begin. The distant rumble of dynamite echoed through Virginia City's narrow valley as Matthew Harris stood at the edge of the mining camp, watching smoke rise from the new railroad tunnel. The women's revelations from the night before weighed heavy on his mind. Their tale of corporate corruption and buried bodies in the mountain passes had shaken his faith in the very progress he'd championed. Rebecca Young's words haunted him most. "Every foot of track is bought with blood money and sealed with silence." Thunder rolled across the peaks as Matthew made his way down to where the women had taken shelter in an abandoned mining office. Through the grimy windows, he could see them huddled around a table, poring over documents they'd smuggled out of Santa Fe. Victoria Lewis stood guard at the door, her dark eyes wary as she admitted him. Inside, Hannah Wright was tracing lines on a map with trembling fingers. "These survey routes," Hannah explained, spreading out the wrinkled papers. "They're all deliberately plotted through unstable ground. The railroad knows these tunnels will collapse. They're counting on it. Each disaster lets them buy up more land at panic prices while their own men quietly scout the real routes they plan to use." The implications made Matthew's stomach turn. He'd lost friends in those accidents. John King burst through the door, his face ashen. "Railroad men are coming up from town, at least 20 of them. They know the women are here." Grace Harris, Matthew's sister who'd joined their cause, moved to bar the door while Abigail Young gathered their evidence. They had minutes at most before discovery. Matthew's hand instinctively moved to his rifle, but Rebecca caught his arm. "Violence won't solve this," she warned. The sound of horses and angry voices grew closer. Matthew's mind raced. The old vertical shaft behind the office connected to a maze of tunnels. If they could reach the lower levels, there might be a chance to escape through one of the abandoned claims. But David Lewis, Victoria's husband who'd infiltrated the railroad company, had warned them about cave-ins throughout the system. It would be a desperate gamble. "There's another way," Hannah said suddenly, pulling a final document from her satchel. "This is proof that Andrew Wright, the railroad's chief engineer, has been embezzling funds meant for proper tunnel supports. He's in Virginia City right now meeting with investors." Her eyes gleamed with purpose. "If we can expose him publicly with witnesses, the whole scheme falls apart." The mob outside had reached the mining camp's edge. Matthew could see torchlight through the windows as men spread out among the buildings. Time was running out. He looked at the women who'd risked everything to uncover this corruption, then at his sister Grace. They'd come too far to back down now. "The investor meeting," he said. "It's happening at the miners' exchange." "If we can get there." Victoria took charge, her voice steady despite the danger. "Rebecca and I will create a diversion at the north end of camp. Matthew, you and Grace escort Hannah to the exchange with the documents. Abigail, use the confusion to get word to David. He'll know which investors we can trust." The plan was dangerous, but it was their only chance to bring the truth to light before more lives were lost to corporate greed. As the others prepared to move, Matthew pulled Grace aside. "This isn't your fight," he said softly. "You can still walk away." His sister's jaw set stubbornly as she checked her pistol. "It became my fight when they killed Michael," she replied, naming her late husband who'd died in one of the accidental cave-ins. "Besides, someone needs to watch your back, brother." Outside, the first shouts of "search every building" echoed between the structures. The office's back door opened onto a narrow trail between tailings piles. Matthew led the way, rifle ready, as Hannah clutched her precious documents and Grace brought up the rear. Behind them, they heard Victoria and Rebecca starting their diversion, something involving a powder magazine and a lot of noise. The night exploded with shouts and running feet as the railroad men rushed to investigate. They were halfway to town when the first shots rang out. Someone had spotted them. A bullet whined off rocks nearby as they dove for cover behind an ore cart. Grace returned fire, forcing their pursuers to seek shelter. "Keep going," she yelled to Matthew and Hannah. "I'll hold them here." Before Matthew could protest, his sister was already moving to a better position, drawing the gunman's attention. Hannah's hand found Matthew's arm in the darkness. "She's right. We have to reach the exchange before Andrew Wright finishes his meeting. Everything depends on exposing him in front of those investors." Matthew hesitated, torn between family loyalty and their larger mission. Another exchange of gunfire made the decision for him. Together, they raced toward the lights of Virginia City, leaving Grace to guard their retreat. The miners' exchange loomed ahead, its windows bright with lamplight. But as they approached, Matthew spotted more railroad men closing in from the side streets. They were nearly surrounded. Hannah clutched the documents to her chest, her face set with determination. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "promise me you'll get these papers to the investors. Promise me the truth will come out." Matthew nodded grimly. One way or another, this night would change everything. Matthew and Hannah burst through the exchange's heavy oak doors just as Andrew Wright was concluding his presentation. The grand hall fell silent, dozens of well-dressed investors turning to stare at the disheveled pair. Wright's practiced smile faltered for just a moment before he recovered, spreading his arms wide in false welcome. "Ah, young Matthew, I wasn't expecting you to join us this evening." And who is your companion? The room's tension was palpable as Hannah stepped forward, her voice clear and steady despite their harrowing journey. My name is Hannah Morrison, and I have evidence of what your railroad really costs. She held up the documents, pages crackling in the stunned silence. Not just in dollars and cents, but in lives. Several investors shifted uncomfortably in their seats as she continued. 3 communities displaced, 2 water sources poisoned, and dozens of families forced from their land through forged deeds and manufactured debts. Wright's facade of civility cracked as he signaled to his men near the doors. But Matthew was ready, drawing his revolver with practiced speed. "Nobody moves," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of years spent defending his land. "These good people deserve to hear the truth." Outside, more gunfire erupted. Grace was still holding off Wright's reinforcements, buying them precious time. Hannah began reading from the papers, her words painting a damning picture of corruption and cruelty. The investors' expressions shifted from skepticism to shock as she revealed detailed accounts of Wright's machinations, the bribes, the threats, the carefully orchestrated accidents that befell those who refused to sell. One elderly gentleman stood up, his face flushed with anger. "Is this true, Wright? Did you really order the burning of the Morrison homestead?" Before Wright could respond, Victoria burst into the hall through a side entrance, her dress torn and dirty, but her bearing still proud. "Every word is true," she declared. "I was his clerk. I watched him plan it all, and I've spent the last 3 months gathering proof." She produced her own set of documents, ledgers, correspondence, and contracts that corroborated Hannah's accusations. Wright's composure finally shattered. With a roar of rage, he drew a hidden derringer and aimed at Hannah. Matthew's reaction was instant, but someone else was faster. Rebecca, who had been posing as one of the serving girls, brought a heavy silver tray down on Wright's wrist. The small gun clattered to the floor as more of the mysterious women revealed themselves among the crowd, each covering a different exit. The sound of horses and wagons filled the street outside. The cavalry had finally arrived, summoned by Grace's signal fire. Wright's men, realizing their position was hopeless, began laying down their weapons. But Wright himself wasn't finished. He crashed through a window onto the balcony, clearly intending to escape across the rooftops. Matthew pursued him into the cold mountain air, their boots crunching on fresh snow as they raced above Virginia City's streets. The chase ended at the edge of the mining district, where the drop to the rail yard below seemed endless in the moonlight. Wright turned, his expensive coat flapping in the wind, and Matthew saw something change in the man's eyes, a final, terrible acceptance. "You don't understand," Wright said, his voice barely audible above the wind. "The railroad must come. It's bigger than all of us. The future demands it." He took a step backward, teetering on the edge. Matthew lunged forward, but it was too late. Wright's last smile was almost peaceful as he fell, disappearing into the darkness below. In the aftermath, as dawn broke over the mountains, the investors signed new contracts, ones that would ensure fair treatment and compensation for the affected communities. Hannah and her sisters emerged from hiding, finally free to reclaim their identities and their lives. The railroad would still come to Virginia City, but on different terms, with different men at its helm. Matthew found Grace tending to her horse, tired but unharmed. "You knew about them all along, didn't you?" he asked, nodding toward Hannah and the others. Grace smiled enigmatically. "Sometimes the best way to fight injustice is to gather those who've suffered from it." Each of those women had something stolen by Wright: land, family, dignity. Together, they found the strength to take it back. The morning sun painted the snow-capped peaks gold as Matthew watched Hannah directing the cleanup efforts. She caught his eye and smiled, and he realized that while this chapter of their story had ended, something new was just beginning. The frontier was changing, but perhaps now it would change for the better, shaped by those who understood the true cost of progress. The morning sun cast long shadows across Virginia City as Matthew Harris stood among the gathered townspeople, watching the final moments of the standoff unfold. Rebecca Young's revelation about the railroad company's secret mining operation had spread like wildfire through the community, turning former enemies into unlikely allies. The women's testimony about the forced labor camps hidden in the mountain passes had shaken even the most hardened souls. Andrew Lewis, the railroad baron's right-hand man, found himself surrounded by miners and ranchers alike, his carefully constructed web of lies finally exposed. The documentation Hannah had smuggled out in her sewing basket provided irrefutable evidence of the company's crimes, how they'd used the expansion project as cover for illegal silver mining, forcing Chinese immigrants and captured drifters to work in deadly conditions. The autumn wind carried the sound of approaching horses as Marshal David Wright led a contingent of federal agents into town. Victoria King stood tall beside Matthew, her hand steady on the rifle she'd used to defend their makeshift sanctuary at the Harris Ranch. The past weeks had transformed her from a frightened escapee into a fierce protector of the other women who'd fled the company's grip. Grace Lewis, Andrew's own sister, testified before the gathered lawmen about how she'd discovered the truth behind her brother's operations. Her words carried special weight, detailing how the railroad's surveyors had intentionally rerouted the tracks to access rich silver deposits, using the women as leverage to keep the miners in line. The shame on Andrew's face spoke volumes as his sister revealed their family's dark secrets. John King, Victoria's husband who'd been presumed dead in a mining accident, emerged from hiding with other survivors. They'd established a network of safe houses in the mountain caves, gathering evidence while the women created their bold escape plan. The reunion between John and Victoria brought tears to many eyes, a reminder of the human cost behind the railroad's greed. Abigail Wright, the marshal's wife and secret operator of an underground message system, finally revealed how she'd coordinated with Rebecca to expose the truth. Her position as a respected lady in Virginia City had provided the perfect cover to gather intelligence and help the escaped women integrate into the community while building their case. The mountain mining operations lay abandoned now, their dark tunnels standing as testament to human cruelty and courage. Matthew remembered the night the women had arrived at his ranch, how their quiet strength had awakened something in him he'd thought long dead. They'd risked everything to bring justice to this remote corner of the territory. Michael Young, Rebecca's brother and a former railroad engineer, provided the final pieces of evidence. His detailed maps and ledgers showed how the company had diverted water sources to hide their illegal operations, causing drought conditions that had devastated local ranches. The systematic nature of their corruption stunned even the federal agents. As Andrew Lewis and his conspirators were led away in chains, the townsfolk began the process of healing. The railroad would still come through Virginia City, but now under federal oversight and proper contracts. The Chinese laborers were freed with compensation, many choosing to settle in the growing community that had fought for their liberation. Matthew watched as Hannah organized aid for the former prisoners, her quiet efficiency a stark contrast to the trembling woman who'd first stepped off that wagon. The Harris Ranch had become a symbol of refuge, its boundaries expanded to accommodate those who needed a fresh start. The old rules of the frontier had indeed changed, shaped by the courage of those who dared to speak truth to power. The autumn days grew shorter as Virginia City rebuilt itself. The women who had arrived in secrecy now walked proudly through the streets, their stories woven into the fabric of the community. Rebecca's medical skills, learned in desperate circumstances, found new purpose in establishing the town's first proper hospital. Justice had come to the mountains, but not through gunfights or typical frontier violence. Instead, it was the careful gathering of evidence, the building of trust, and the strength of unlikely alliances that had prevailed. Matthew realized that his role as a rancher had evolved into something greater, a guardian of this new way of life where truth and dignity mattered more than power. The railroad tracks would follow a different route now, one that respected the land and its people. The mountains still held silver, but it would be mined legally, with proper safety measures and fair wages. The former mining tunnels were sealed, though some said you could still hear whispers of the past in the wind that swept through the peaks. As winter approached, Matthew and Victoria stood on his ranch's porch, watching new families settle into homes built with lumber from the dismantled mining operation. Their victory had transformed more than just Virginia City. It had shown that the frontier's future belonged to those who could imagine justice beyond the barrel of a gun. The story of the women who changed Virginia City became legend, passed down through generations. But unlike typical tales of the West, it spoke not of quick-draw showdowns or lone heroes, but of courage that grew in silence, of truth that survived in darkness, and of a community that found its soul by standing together against corruption. Marshal Wright maintained a watchful peace, but the real guardians of the new order were the citizens themselves. They had learned that true strength lay not in weapons or wealth, but in the bonds forged through shared struggle. The mountains stood witness to their transformation, their ancient faces unchanged, yet somehow less threatening in the light of justice. As winter settled over Virginia City, Hannah found herself standing at the edge of the new rail yard, watching steam rise from the first locomotive to arrive on tracks laid by freemen paid fair wages. The steel rails gleaming in the snow marked more than just a connection to distant places. They represented the promise of legitimate commerce replacing the old chains of exploitation. She pulled her shawl tighter, remembering the hidden wagon ride that had brought her here just months ago. Rebecca had established a school in one of the converted mining offices, teaching not just reading and arithmetic, but also the true history of the West, including the stories of those who had been silenced. The children of both settlers and miners sat side by side, learning that strength could wear many faces. The sound of their voices carried across the valley where men had once toiled in fearful silence. Marshall Wright and Victoria had married in a quiet ceremony, their union symbolizing the bridge between law and justice that the town had struggled to build. Together, they worked to ensure that the new railroad brought prosperity without the corruption that had once threatened to destroy everything. The marshal's office now housed records of property deeds registered to women, a change that would have been unthinkable before. Grace had transformed the old saloon into a meeting hall where the town council gathered, its walls now echoing with debates instead of gunfights. She often sat quietly in the back, a small smile playing across her face as she watched former enemies work together to solve common problems. The whiskey bottles behind the bar had been replaced with books and maps, tools for building a different kind of future. In the hills above town, Abigail supervised the conversion of abandoned mine shafts into storage cellars for the growing community's harvest. The dark tunnels that had once held so many secrets now protected the fruits of honest labor. She had insisted that every entrance bear a plaque remembering those who had suffered there, ensuring that the past would instruct rather than haunt the present. The railroad brought new faces to Virginia City, but the town's transformation had given it the strength to absorb change without losing its soul. The women who had arrived in secret now walked openly through streets they had helped reshape. Their influence spread along the rail lines to other frontier towns, carried by travelers who marveled at the unusual peace they found in this mountain community. As spring approached, Hannah received word that similar wagons of women had begun arriving in Laredo and Amarillo, seeking refuge and finding inspiration in Virginia City's example. The network of safety and support she and her companions had built was growing, offering hope to those who still lived in shadow. The frontier was learning that progress meant more than just steel rails and wooden ties. On clear days, the peaks around Virginia City seemed to touch the clouds, their unchanging presence a reminder of how brief human struggles were in the grand scope of time. Yet Hannah knew that some changes, once made, could alter the very bedrock of society. She thought of the women still making their way west, no longer alone, no longer silent, and smiled at the future taking shape before her. The town prepared for its first spring festival, not to celebrate gunfighters or gold strikes, but to honor the quiet strength that had reshaped their community. The mining company's ledgers, once tools of oppression, had been transformed into a record of triumph, page after page listing the names of those who had found their voice and their freedom in the shadow of the mountains. As darkness fell over Virginia City, lanterns twinkled in windows where families gathered to share stories of the past year's transformation. The night wind carried whispers of hope instead of fear, and the stars seemed to shine brighter over a town that had finally learned to see clearly. The frontier had changed, not through violence but through the steady pressure of truth and solidarity, proving that even the hardest stone could be shaped by persistent drops of water.